And so, I'm sorry, here's a blow up of that graph. And so here's the climate impact of the average US household food consumption, at least according to these authors out of Carnegie Mellon. And again, delivery, which is this tiny little blue sliver on the far left-hand side of the graph, contributes in total only about 4% of the carbon footprint. But it may turn out that local is better from an environmental perspective for another reason, a reason that often isn't talked about. And that is because it may be, and this is an area that needs more research, and we're currently doing some of that, it may be that producing things here being Oregon or here being the United States, has lower impacts on the environment because of how we make things. Now this is a double-edged sword, because here I'm showing an example, just the carbon intensity of industrial energy, comparing the United States and China. I've set US equal to 100. So if you make something in China using the average industrial energy mix in China, its greenhouse gas impact is, on average, 40% higher than making that same thing in the United States, all other things being equal. If you use the same technologies with the same efficiencies and everything's the same except the energy mix, because China's energy supplies are more carbon intensive, the carbon footprint is 40% higher if you produce things in China. Now, if we put Germany or Norway on this graph, it would be lower than the United States. So this is a bit of a double-edged sword, but given the countries that we tend to import from, it's not Germany and Norway, it's China and Indonesia and Vietnam, and other countries that have relatively dirty fuel mixes, relatively lax environmental standards, very high tolerance of pollution by industry. It may be that production in the United States and things made in the United States have lower environmental footprints just because we have relatively, let me say relatively, clean energy mixes and production processes here. We could do better, and we need to do better. But this may be the much more compelling case for buying locally. Just one other attribute I wanted to explore, and that is packaging. People love to get bent out of shape around packaging. Packaging is highly visible, and packaging, one of the reasons that packaging, I think, garners a lot of scorn in the environmental community is because packaging is what you bring home from the store that you never wanted. You know, you never went to the store and said, oh, honey, let's go buy some clamshells. You know, let's go buy some cardboard boxes or some paperboard boxes. You wanted the stuff that was inside the packaging, and you bring it home, and then you eat it or you wear it, and you're left with this pile of stuff that you really don't want. And so people get concerned around packaging. I think it's a bit of a distraction. And here is a graph from the Sightline Institute in Seattle that looks at the embodied energy required to produce shopping bags, plastic and paper bags, in both cases very small, and then they compare it against the energy required to produce the food that goes into the shopping bags, given two different diets, a plant-based diet and then an omnivorous diet that combines plants and meat. And clearly what goes into the shopping bag is a whole lot more impactful than the bag itself. And so a rational approach to reducing the environmental impacts of products and materials and consumption would focus on where the big impacts are, and it probably wouldn't lead us to focus much on packaging. So which product attributes are more important? Based on my review of the literature and what I've shared with you today, I would like to suggest that energy efficiency, energy use, waste prevention, that's the amount of stuff used, and country of origin are likely the most important attributes. Whether something is recyclable or recycled content, bio-based or biodegradable, unless it's something you're actually discharging into the water, you know, like laundry detergent or something. Whether it's local or what its packaging attributes are of less importance. I do want to emphasize that these are only generalizations and there will be exceptions. But if we really want to reduce the environmental impacts of products, if we really want to understand them, we're going to have to study them. And as we do so, there's going to be some of this cognitive dissonance where we learn that some of the attributes that we love to use might not correlate very well the way we'd like them to. But at the end of the day, I'm okay with that, because if we really want to be effective at reducing environmental impacts, we have to focus on what those impacts are as opposed to how we feel about them, you know, or what we think about them based on some magazine article we read 15 years ago. So the challenge is is how do we understand these impacts? And I didn't talk much at all about the methodology around life cycle analysis or impact assessment for products. That's a whole nother talk. But what I want to leave you with is the methods here are advancing. In the last few years, there's been an explosion of interest and work in this field. That's mostly a good thing. There is the potential for some greenwashing, but generally speaking, the task ahead is both exciting and challenging. And I'll stop here in the interest of time. We have about 6 or 7 minutes, and would be very interested to hear hear your thoughts about this, if anything was surprising to you, or if you have any questions or topics you'd like to explore further. That's a great question, and for the recording, let me try to summarize it. The question is there a way in which this information about the environmental impacts of products can be made available to consumers to help inform their purchasing decisions? A great question, and one that actually there's several thorny issues all tangled together there, so let me try to untangle them for you. First of all, a little bit of background. There are a few countries where this is already occurring, at least with regards to climate. Sweden is requiring climate labeling of foods. Japan is requiring carbon labeling or greenhouse gas labeling of certain consumer products. So there are some efforts underway in some other countries to make this a requirement. And that's actually one of the things that's driving a lot of this analysis, is that the companies that operate globally are understanding if they want to sell into those markets, they have to understand their carbon footprint because they have to document it. And that is having a perhaps surprising, perhaps not benefit, which is as the consumer products companies are conducting these carbon footprints of their products, they're discovering along the way, some easy opportunities to reduce impacts. So even if you don't put a carbon label on the product, but even if you just do a carbon footprint or require or incent a carbon footprint or do any of those things, it's probably going to lead to some environmental benefits. Now, the idea of actually putting a carbon label or an environmental impacts label on a product, there's a couple of other issues here. First is that in order for consumers to be able to compare two competing brands of the same product, there would be a need for the environmental label for that product, for those brands, to be developed in a consistent manner so that the consumer could know that they were actually comparing apples to apples. Because as you can imagine with life cycle analysis, there are opportunities to define your boundaries and define your accounting standards in such a way that certain things get left out or counted differently than your competitor. And nobody wants that, or at least nobody I know wants that. Nobody wants people gaming the system. So there's a lot of work happening right now at a foundational level to develop what are called product category rules. And a product category rule is a standard typically for a category like floor coverings that says, okay, if anyone's going to do a carbon footprint or an environmental footprint of a floor covering, this is the accounting standard they have to use. And then if everyone follows that standard, then the resulting studies should be comparable and the results should be reproducible. That's some important foundational work that has to be done first. And it's starting to move in certain product categories. Others not, but it will eventually. You also raised the issue of having a single score. And it's very attractive because who really wants to go into the supermarket and while you're reading about your breakfast cereals, compare not only their saturated fat and their unsaturated fat, but also their greenhouse gases and their eutrophication, right? Wouldn't it be better just to have a single number? The problem with having a single number is that you have all these different environmental impacts. You have acidification, you have ecotoxicity, you have human toxicity, you have respiratory effects, you have global warming, you have non-renewable energy, water consumption, blah, blah, blah. And if you roll them all together into a single number, who does the weighting? Someone would have to say, global warming is twice as important as human toxicity. And then someone else would say, no, human toxicity is 3 times more important than global warming. And so I'm not particularly optimistic, nor am I inclined to support a single number. And although I understand the beauty of it from the consumer's perspective, I think it's potentially misleading.